Back then, the winter of 1945 was cruel. The Alps were heavy with snow, and the wind whispered through the forests like the ghosts of battles past. Villages slept under a blanket of white, silent except for the distant echo of artillery and the occasional rumble of tanks. Castle Itter, perched high on a ridge, looked serene, like a painting. But inside, it was chaos waiting to unfold. Prisoners of war, politicians, and celebrities captured by the Nazis, men who once had voices in the world, were trapped behind stone walls, cut off from hope. And yet, hope sometimes arrives in the most unlikely forms. I remember the way the soldiers moved, cautious, tired, yet resolute. On one side, Americans, young men with letters from home tucked into their pockets, some still dreaming of baseball games and dances they would never attend. On the other, German soldiers. Yes, Germans. Not SS, not monsters, just men. Men caught in the storm of a collapsing Reich. They didn't know each other well, but fate has a strange sense of humor. That day, it would throw them together against a common enemy, the SS. And then the SS arrived. Fanatical, ruthless. They came like wolves in the night, intent on death, on destruction, on the cruelest end imaginable for the prisoners. But what they didn't expect was unity. Imagine the faces of men who had been enemies, now side by side. Their breaths misted in the freezing air, guns raised, hearts hammering. Fear, yes, but also something else. Courage that comes only when you have no choice but to stand together. I can still see it. The way they fought, shouting orders, falling, rising again, the snow turning red in patches. It was madness, and yet in that madness a strange beauty. Because even in the darkest hour, humanity flickers like a candle in the wind. The morning after. Silence. Not the peace of snow-covered mountains, but the heavy, waiting silence of anticipation. Every shadow could hide an enemy, every distant crack a harbinger of death. Inside Castle Itter, the prisoners huddled together, some whispering prayers, some whispering names of loved ones. They had learned the value of small things, warm blankets, a shared loaf of bread, the mere sound of a familiar voice. And then came the Americans, young men with rifles, with courage stitched into their very bones, storming through the gates. But they were not alone, because among them, unexpectedly, were German soldiers who had chosen honor over ideology, men who had seen too much and finally decided enough was enough. Imagine that. Enemies turned allies, fighting not for flags, not for glory, but for something much smaller, much more human, survival. And in the cold, wind-lashed courtyard, they formed a line, ready to meet the SS head-on. The SS approached like a nightmare made real. They were precise, trained, relentless. But the defenders of Castle Itter had something else: determination. And sometimes that is stronger than any weapon. Shots rang out, echoing off stone walls. Snow turned to mud, mud to blood, and still the line held. One American, a young corporal named, names fade over time, but his courage did not. He moved through the hail of bullets, dragging wounded men to safety, shouting encouragement even when his voice cracked. And the Germans beside him, men who had spent years under the Nazi banner, now risking their lives for strangers, for the captured politicians and soldiers who had done nothing wrong. It was strange. It was beautiful. It was history bending in ways no one could imagine. Time slowed. Moments stretched into eternity. A hand gripping a rifle, a glance across a snowy courtyard, the look of fear and resolve in every eye. It is impossible to capture it all, but it mattered. Every heartbeat mattered. And then, far off, the faint sound of reinforcements, like the first rays of sun breaking through storm clouds. Hope, a fragile, trembling hope, but enough to push them onward, to make them believe maybe they could survive this night. By noon, the air around Castle Itter had changed. Smoke hung low over the snow, the acrid scent of gunpowder biting the cold air. The SS had surrounded them, pressing in like a tightening fist. Every corner of the courtyard echoed with gunfire. Every breath came with a taste of fear. The defenders were running low on ammunition. The walls shook under mortar fire. Yet no one ran. Not the Americans, not the German Wehrmacht soldiers, not even the prisoners, former politicians, generals, and artists who had once spoken in marble halls but now crouched in muddy trenches. Among those prisoners was a French tennis champion, and beside him a German soldier who'd once worn the eagle on his chest. Together they fired from the same barricade, two men who only months earlier might have killed each other on sight. Up on the tower, a single machine gun rattled, manned by an American sergeant whose uniform was tattered and bloodied. Every bullet he fired bought another second of life for the men below. When his gun jammed, he fixed it with trembling hands, whispering to himself, "Not yet, not today." Down in the courtyard, a German officer, Major Joseph Zepp Gangl, moved through the chaos like a man on borrowed time. He had once sworn loyalty to the Reich, but that day his loyalty was to humanity. He shouted commands in German and English alike, guiding both sides with calm precision. He knew this fight wasn't about victory. It was about redemption, about leaving something behind that wasn't tainted by the madness of war. The SS pressed harder. Bullets chipped stone, tearing holes through centuries-old walls. The defenders retreated room by room, step by step, until the castle's courtyard was littered with the wounded and dying. And then Gangles saw it. A French prisoner trapped in the open, pinned by SS fire. Without hesitation, he ran forward. No cover, no shield, just courage. He reached the man, dragged him toward safety. A shot rang out, and Gangle fell. They say he died instantly. A German officer, once part of Hitler's army, killed while saving a French prisoner and defending Americans. History rarely writes poetry, but that day it did. For a moment, the men faltered. They looked at Gangle's lifeless form, then at each other, and something changed. Rage gave way to purpose. Fear turned into fury. The castle's defenders rose once more, shouting, firing, pushing back against the tide. Every bullet was a heartbeat, every scream an oath. They fought not as Americans or Germans, but as men who refused to surrender to darkness. And then, through the smoke, came a sound. Engines. Dozens of them. The Americans from the 142nd Infantry Division had arrived, charging up the mountain road with everything they had left. The SS, now trapped, broke and scattered into the trees. Some fled, some surrendered. And as the sun dipped below the mountains, the last shots faded into silence. Castle Itter still stood, damaged, scarred, soaked in blood, but still standing. And so did its defenders, what was left of them. That day, Americans and Germans fought together, not as enemies, not as conquerors, but as men choosing humanity over hate. When the gunfire stopped, the silence felt strange. No more shouting, no more explosions, just the faint moan of the wounded, the crackle of distant flames, and the soft hiss of falling snow landing on stone and steel. Castle Itter was broken, but alive. Smoke drifted from shattered windows. Walls that had stood for centuries bore the scars of bullets and mortar blasts. And in the courtyard lay the cost of courage. Medics moved among the fallen, Americans, Germans, and even a few SS prisoners, now silent, their rage extinguished. The air reeked of gunpowder, but also of something else, something sacred, the smell of sacrifice. Major Joseph Gangle's body was laid beside the castle gate. An American soldier covered him with a torn field jacket, then stood quietly, his helmet in his hands. "He fought like one of us," he murmured, and no one disagreed. The surviving prisoners, French politicians, generals, even a tennis star, walked among their rescuers in disbelief. Some embraced their liberators, others simply stared, too numb to speak. For them, freedom had always been a dream wrapped in barbed wire. And for the Americans and Germans who fought that day, something had changed. They had looked into the eyes of their so-called enemies and seen themselves. Fear, hope, exhaustion, all the same. The illusion of difference melted away like snow in spring. Later, when the reinforcements secured the area and the prisoners were escorted down the mountain, the men of Castle Itter stood together one last time. A moment of stillness, no speeches, no cheers, just the understanding that they had shared something rare, something history would almost forget. For years after the war, the story of Castle Itter barely appeared in books. It was too strange, too human for the tidy lines of history. Germans and Americans fighting together against the SS? It didn't fit the narrative of heroes and villains. But truth doesn't vanish just because it's inconvenient. It lingers, waiting for someone to remember. Those who survived went on with their lives. Some returned home. Some never spoke of it again. One German soldier became a carpenter in Austria, carving toys for children. An American sergeant settled in Kansas, where he planted apple trees that still bloom today. And somewhere in France, a man who once cowered behind the walls of Castle Itter told his grandchildren that not all Germans were monsters, that sometimes good men find each other, even in the darkest of times. Decades later, historians would call it the strangest battle of World War II. But to the men who were there, it wasn't strange at all. It was simple. They were soldiers. They saw innocent lives in danger, and they chose to stand together. Maybe that's what humanity really is. Moments like that, when hate fails, when courage wins. And Castle Itter still stands today. Moss creeps along its walls. The courtyard is quiet, the scars of war fading under time's gentle hand. If you listen closely, you might still hear echoes in the wind, the gunfire, the shouts, the heartbeat of men who refused to surrender to darkness. And in that echo, maybe a reminder that even in war, even in chaos, the human spirit endures. If you've been moved by this story of courage, sacrifice, and unlikely unity, don't forget to like this video, share it with those who love history, and subscribe to the channel for more forgotten tales of World War II. Because history isn't just dates and battles, it's people, and their stories deserve to be remembered. This was the Battle of Castle Itter, where enemies became brothers and darkness met its match.